regarding our opinion on what's happening with Victor Wembanyama. He's a famous basketball player, first overall pick in the draft, and he's having a great year, and he's an incredibly talented guy. Most of the articles I read online just stated that he had developed a blood clot in his shoulder. And many of those articles went on to describe other NBA players who had developed blood clots. And that's about it. It's not very medical. There is a single reporter who's done a great job, and I'm about to post a blog post in detail on this reporter who he's a sports journalist, and he's really dug into it, and I agree with what he's doing. The fact is that a lot of players, the NBA players who are famous and who have been diagnosed with quote unquote blood clots, have been diagnosed with actual pulmonary emboli, where the blood clots are found in the lungs. Now, in that setting, you don't know where the blood clots came from, but they came from somewhere else. And the medical literature shows us that the vast majority of those come from the legs. And what we strongly suspect is that these very tall players are cramped in airline seats and they have to stay on those flights and they have less mobility and the blood doesn't flow so well, partly because of their positioning and partly because they're so tall they don't have a lot of space. And in many of these famous NBA players, clots were discovered in their legs, either at the time of the initial diagnosis or later. But the players who develop blood clots in the shoulder is a completely different story and a different mechanism. And in those patients, we should be more likely to consider venous thoracic outlet syndrome, not an airplane flight causing it. And in Victor Wembanyama's case, my blog post will explain why, but I'll state this quickly. A recent review in 2022 of a very large international registry of patients with acute blood clots. There's an earlier one performed in 2017 as well. They studied about 40,000 patients with blood clots, and only about 5% of those were in the upper extremity. And then if you take all of those with the blood clots in the upper extremity, there were about 4,200 patients, and only 200 of those, or 5%, had venous thoracic outlet syndrome. 70% plus had diagnoses like active cancer, recent surgery, immobilization for 4 days, estrogen treatment, pregnancy. These are things that do not apply to young athletes. And as one of our early questions referred to, overhead athletes, young people, get this particular disease, Paget-Schroeder syndrome, or effort thrombosis, where they're more prone to getting these injuries to their veins and blood clot formation. But what this study also showed is of the 200 patients, or the 5% who had venous TOS, that those patients tended to be younger, 20 years younger, and they tended to be male. And they tended never to have had a blood clot before, that this was the first presentation. And those are some indications that Victor Wembanyama may have thoracic outlet syndrome.